Hello there. In this lecture, this is the one of our final two. This is part one of Texas from about 1978 to modern day times. And so this is going to kind of bridge and cover different topics that start in 1978 and kind of bring us to where we are in Texas today from a historical perspective. So let's go ahead and get started. So one thing that we talked about in the previous lecture that we'll get into more discussion about this time as well is the changes from the 1960s and 70s in the Democratic Party in Texas. Specifically, we see the Democratic Party in general throughout the nation really change. This comes in the early 1960s, really with Nixon's first try at the presidency, and then for sure in 1968 with this election where he takes on the Southern strategy, woos the Dixiecrats, and brings them over to the Republican Party. We start to see in Texas itself going from a one-party system of the Democrats that were very factionalized to two different political parties that really emerge, and two-party culture that we see today in Texas itself. By 1996, the Republicans gained control of the Texas Senate, and by 2002, they gained the control of the House, too. We're talking about the Texas legislature, not the U.S. legislature. The 2014 midterms were significant as well. That's where we see Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick really embrace the ideology of the pretty new Tea Party that emerged in 2009. So we'll talk about that within this lecture and within the next. But I think that this is a really great graphic that I'm going to show you, and I'll kind of let this roll. But this gives you an idea of the way that the office holders changed over time. And really with that too, this is done in 2014, but I think this is really an interesting graphic. So you can take a look at this. I'll give it a moment to kind of swing through it a couple times. If you pause it, it won't do you any good. But you can see the time, and it goes from the 60s all the way to 2014. So relatively modern. I don't know exactly what it would be today. I'd be interested to see if they updated this graphic from there. But anyway, I think that's a pretty interesting graphic. So we get a Republican governor in 1978, an oil man by the name of Bill Clements. He was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. This is significant because the Republicans from Reconstruction were way different than the Republicans in the 1970s. So the Democrats themselves were divided, which causes this Republican to come into office pretty easily. That's because the Democrats themselves were undergoing quite a bit of an identity crisis in the 70s. Should we be moderate? Should we be liberal? Probably really not that different than what we're kind of seeing today with the progressivism inside the Democratic Party right now. But Dolph Briscoe had made some comments actually here in San Antonio against somebody in particular, or the Black community themselves. Instead of trying to care about the Black community, he kind of pushed them away. There's a Black person by the name of Bellinger, and his family was very influential in San Antonio. And when he pushed away from Briscoe, so did a lot of other Democrats, going more to John Hill. But needless to say, it still signifies this Republican takeover in Texas for sure. A couple things that he focused on: cutting prison spending and teacher salary, reducing state spending. And he really is very similar to what we see in 1980, which is the Reagan Revolution, or the Republican kind of takeover in the 1980s. Now, it's interesting that cutting prison spending was a focus for him because Texas had one of the largest incarceration rates, still does today, and a growing number of students. So cutting in these two areas is not going to really work out for him. I do also want to talk about the parties become divided in the 70s over conservative versus liberal. And when I use this term, by the way, I'm referring to liberals as Democrats by this point and conservatives as Republican. And this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of where they stand at that time. But, you know, conservatives really blamed liberals for taxes being high and money spent in the wrong places. Now we know in reality that the money that was spent, federal government during this time period, was mainly spent on defense and in the Cold War. Um, but they do focus on this smaller government, and that's really what Reagan himself focuses on. Okay, but the other thing that happens during this time period is we see the religious right begin to emerge in the 70s, really predominantly in the 80s. Jerry Falwell was a reverend. He kind of comes up with this idea of the moral majority, that political organizations have kind of a moral religious obligation to fill. And so he very outspoken, as long in addition to other evangelical Christians that identify with this group, against the Equal Rights Amendment, against Roe versus Wade, and against LGBTQ rights too. This is a really strong group, about 2 million voters in 1980. So they were ones that definitely did not want to be ignored. So Reagan definitely signified a movement of politics beginning in the 1980s. He was actually a B movie actor, which probably many of you know. He was a former governor from California. He chose a Texas oil man by the name of George H. Herbert Walker, H.W. Bush. He was actually, H.W. was actually from the Northeast. He went to Yale and he moved to Midland, Texas and became an oil man. But this kind of gives you a little bit of background on Reagan himself. He was known as the great communicator. His speeches were well known, and he spoke to the public at a time in the 70s in which there was quite a bit of economic distress. And even though Republicans made up the majority of the time in office in the 1970s, it pretty heavily laid on Jimmy Carter, who was president from 77 to 1981. And that's pretty common amongst, that's pretty common in presidencies. It many times how the president's going to do is based on how the economy is doing, even though very few times, if any, if really, and any economist will really tell you this, is the economy to blame or the president to blame for the economy. Not as big of a factor as what people really think, I believe. So 1980s in Texas, what does it really look like? A couple key things. There were more opportunities for women and minorities, although, not as many as many women would like. Sandra Day O'Connor, Ann Richards, significant people, and Ann Richards will later become governor. I'll talk about her in the next presentation in a little bit. But Mark White beats Clements in the next governorship. He's going to be the next governor, and in the 1982 race. And during this, he passes a controversial thing, and it related to any extracurricular activities in Texas, still in place today. It's called No Pass, No Play. The other kind of big issue in Texas at this time was the amount of funding that was going to wealthier schools. And we'll talk about that. Because of the fact that Texas got its money for funding for schools from property taxes, that meant wealthier districts got a plethora more money per pupil than poorer districts did. In the next election, Clements challenges him and beats White in the next one. And a lot of this was because of the education issue. And also in the 1980s in Texas, we saw a big downturn in oil prices because of the fact that the oil crisis in the Middle East is gone. And now that's going to cause Texas oil demands to go down. Okay, so we're going to talk specifically about the inequity in schools. This is a really important case, and it relates to San Antonio schools at that. So Alamo Heights, to put this in perspective, which many of you know where Alamo Heights is, had 14 times the money that Edgewood schools had because of the property tax, because of the way that Texas funded its schools. So you can see the difference. The amount of money they spent per year per pupil in Edgewood versus Alamo Heights. So in response to this, the MALDEF, which is the NAACP legal fund equivalent for Mexican American rights, they challenge Texas's method of financing these public schools. They said that the Texas Constitution obligated the state legislature to provide an efficient and a free public school system. And the fact this system produced disparities between the schools. It squashed their ability to hire good teachers, to build appropriate facilities, to offer a strong curriculum, and match that of wealthier districts. And so this goes all the way to the Texas Supreme Court, not the the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Texas Supreme Court, and a unanimous ruling, 9-0, they ruled in favor of Edgewood. And they tasked the state of Texas for putting in an equitable system by 1990, which to this day is still a very challenging thing for Texas schools. It's still not completely equitable. I know that doesn't come as a surprise to many of you. So the other thing that happens is that after Reagan's presidency, because Reagan was an incredibly popular president, his vice president pretty easily wins that, and that, of course, is Texas oil man George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush. He sided with more of the religious right, although I would hesitate to call him a far right wing. I don't think that's what we see today. His policies are actually very moderate in general, and there wasn't much difference between his policies and Clinton's policies. Both of them probably considered pretty moderate, especially in today's standards. But he's going to do something that is going to cause him to lose the next election, and that was basically saying, read not my lips, no new taxes. And because of the recession, he ended up having to raise taxes. And even though he was in place during the Persian Gulf War in 1992, a very popular war, which actually increased his popularity, the fact that he had to raise taxes the very next year because of the economic downturn causes him to lose to Clinton the next year. Okay, another significant thing that happens and actually is followed through in Clinton's presidency, but was signed by George H.W. Bush here in San Antonio at the former German school, was NAFTA. And this is still in place today. It stands for the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. And basically, it added Mexico as a free trade zone that we already had with Canada at that time. They thought that it would strengthen the economies of all three. And people, at least opponents were afraid that the jobs would be taken away. But the reality is that it has really increased specifically, Texas economy, because Texas has become the center of trade between Mexico and the United States. So, Texas in particular has benefited from NAFTA in general. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is minority office holders and women office holders. The two women you see here, Ann Richards on the top and Kay Bailey Hutchinson on the bottom. She was Ann Richards is elected. She wins against a guy named Clayton Williams. I'm going to show you a clip of his video, his campaign video. It's kind of interesting. But he was actually winning at first. The campaigns were called Clady versus the Lady. And at first he was winning, but then he makes a really disparaging remark that said that if rape was inevitable, that women should just sit back, relax, and enjoy it. Like, yeah, no joke. And so obviously Ann Richards capitalized on that idea, and she to show the way he was, she becomes the first woman to become elected governor based on her own individual accomplishments. Now, we know Ma Ferguson was actually the first governor, but she was governor because her husband was governor, and he couldn't be governor because he was removed from office, right? Kay Bailey Hutchinson, first Republican woman that becomes a state senator later on, but was at first the state treasurer but that was after Ann Richards was. We do know that there still is an equity for women and minorities, and that shows you some of the stats there, between the two of them. But here's interesting ads between that Ann Richards did and Clayton Williams. So I'm going to show you this one. Let me see if it'll show you here. Hopefully it will.
If we're going to win this war on drugs, we got to get the drug dealers first. Somebody get caught selling drugs, we're going to take their assets, put them in prison, and keep them there. The drugs they sell kill a child, we're going to give them the death penalty. If we're going to lick this drug problem, we're going to have to learn to be tough and stay tough. Somebody tells you we can't win this war on drugs, you tell them they hadn't met Clayton Williams.
So yeah, that was during that war on drugs, right? And you can definitely see that, right? And that's a whole different topic, right? The war on drugs. Here's another one that Ann Richards did, and this is attacking Clayton Williams.
Clayton Williams, in his own words, he called himself, quote, an anti-environmentalist. on rape. It's like the weather. If it's inevitable, relax and enjoy it. On his campaign strategy. I'll head and hoof her and drag her through the dirt. On Ann Richards.
I hope she didn't go back to drinking again.
Governor Williams.
Yeah, and I'll talk about Ann Richards more in the next one, but she was a recovering alcoholic, and that was a pretty low dig there. Okay, so Richards, as governor herself, she becomes the next governor. She was a larger-than-life character in many different ways. She focused heavily on prison and education reform. She used the state lottery, which is still in place today, to help fund education. And part of that was because of the Edgewood case, right? They had to make it equitable funding. And she uses something known as the Robin Hood Plan, which forces wealthier districts to pass money on to poorer districts, and it's still pretty controversial. But that in that sense, it'll make it a little bit more equitable. She does increase prisons instead of like reducing the people that are in prison. This is still very much the war on drugs time period. They increase the prisons themselves to deal with overcrowding. She did place environmental protections, and she outlawed stalking laws and all kinds of things like that. Okay, so I'll get into some other issues during this time period, 1980s forward, the second half, part 2 of modern Texas history in the next lecture.